And good evening, folks, and welcome to tonight's creation viewing party. And this is an Ask Me Anything. My name is Brendan O'Loughlin. I'll be your host for this evening. Before I introduce our panel, I just want to welcome everyone who's coming in from Facebook and from YouTube. I really appreciate you joining us tonight. This event will be recorded, so it'll be available after the event on both YouTube and the Facebook channels. So please have a look at that if you miss any of your questions. Just jump back in later on. Now, can I ask you a small favor, just as you join us tonight? If you could subscribe to the channel, and also if you can hit the like button, it just allows us to get the message out a little bit further. It just helps with the algorithms and people who are searching for us. So if you can do that small favor, just hit that like button, that'd be awesome. So before we move on, I'll just like to introduce our guests tonight. Tonight we've got Dr. John Ashton, and he's a chartered chemist. He's a fellow of the Royal Australian Chemical Institute. He's a fellow of the Australian Institute for Food Science and Technology, strategic research manager for Sanitarium Health Food Company in Australia. He's written quite a few books on the area of creation, and he's an adjunct professor of biomedical science and applied science in Melbourne, Victoria. So I'd like to welcome John. How are you tonight?
Yes, well, thanks. Pretty excited to have the opportunity to talk on this subject. I'm pretty passionate about it. It's something that information in this area really needs to get out to people.
Oh, fantastic. And you're coming from Melbourne, is that correct?
No, just north of Macquarie.
Oh, sorry about that. I thought you were in Melbourne.
No, don't be sorry. It's a nice place.
The other panelist we've got on tonight is Dr. Don Batten, and he doesn't need any introduction, but I'll do the honours anyway. Don received his Bachelor of Science in Agriculture, first class honours, and his PhD from the University of Sydney. He's worked 20 years as in research in the horticultural industry, mostly with New South Wales Department of Agriculture, and most of his research was into tropical fruits, mangoes, lychees, and custard apples. He's the author of a bunch of creation books as well, and he's also one of the rotating editors of Creation Magazine and the In-Depth Journal of Creation. So he was previously the CEO and managing director. He's recently stepped back from that role, which was very time intensive, to take up the role of senior scientist, only to find that there's no time doing that either. But we'd like to welcome Don tonight. Welcome to you both, and welcome, Don.
Thank you, Brendan. Hello, everybody.
So tonight's Ask Me Anything. So over the week, a lot of people have already sent their questions in. So we've got close to 40 questions already tonight. So it's going to be a real tough ask for our panelists to get through all those questions. But what we'd like to do, if you do like to have a question answered, if you can throw it in the chat as we go through tonight, we will try to get to those as we can. Just be aware that most of the questions have already been researched by our panelists to give you answers. So we'll do the best we can as we go. So if the panelists are okay, we'll jump into the first question. Okay, so the first question I'm going to put to you, Don. And this is a question from Pearl, is how long were Adam and Eve in the garden?
We don't think very long, because Cain was conceived after they left the garden, and being fully fertile, being made by God, and then instructed to fill the earth, to be fertile and fill the earth, they would have been fully fertile, which means that they would have conceived within weeks. So we don't believe that they were in the garden for more than a few weeks.
Excellent. Okay, and a follow-up question. I might throw this one to John just to mix things up. Where did Cain get his wife? Oh, let me bring this up. This is another question from Pearl. Where did Cain get his wife, and how many children did Eve have?
Okay, so the Bible tells us that we're all descendant from Adam. That's why Jesus can be our saviour. The Bible also talks about how Adam and Eve had other children, boys and girls. So we also know from those two scenarios that obviously the first family, when Adam and Eve had children, some of those children would have had to have paired off, and then formed new families. So obviously, they married, a brother married a sister. Now, back then, of course, we need to understand that we get one set of genes from our chromosomes from our mother and one from our father. There's a duplicate there for the different parts of our body. So there's sort of like a backup system there. And of course, back in the genes would have been close to being perfect. And so there's no problem with reproduction there. Today, of course, we've accumulated many errors in our genes. And the backup plan is, of course, if you married someone who is a very close relative, the chances are very high that in their genes are going to have the same errors as that you have. So that's why we don't encourage close family marriages. And of course, it's illegal to marry someone within your immediate family now.
Right. And do we know how many children Eve had, or is that not mentioned in the Bible?
It's not mentioned in the Bible. I understand that there's sort of extra biblical documents that say that she had something like 27 children or together, but we can't count things like that, in my view.
Great. Okay, we're going to move on to theistic evolution now. So this is a question for Don. Is theistic evolution a viable option for explaining creation?
In a word, no. We've got the slides there, Jonathan. And so I think they need to go up. Yeah. Anyway, yeah, the problem is not just theistic evolution. This is the idea that God used evolution. And there's various levels of this, but the most academic one, the one that's favoured by people in academia, is basically that theistic evolution is exactly the same as atheistic evolution, except that some way or other it accounts for everything, and it's how, if you like, everything came to be, how creation came to be. But atheistic evolution is exactly the same as theistic evolution, except that atheists don't believe in God. That's about the only difference. So the problem is that theistic evolution accepts that there's hundreds of millions, billions of years of time in the history of the world and the universe. And the problem is that that history is deep, and it involves fossils, which are the remains of once living things, and they are supposedly buried under our feet, representing a history of hundreds of millions of years. The problem with that is that here we have Adam and Eve in the garden, and God said everything was very good. But where do you put all those fossils, those dead things over hundreds of millions of years? Well, the only place you can put them is before the people, which means that they go under the feet of Adam and Eve in the Garden of Eden. And so you have death, disease, and suffering over hundreds of millions of years. And God said it was all very good. It means that death and disease and suffering didn't come because of sin. It was already here. You have multiple consequences for this, not just theistic evolution, but days are long periods of time, the gap theory, all these ideas that want to marry the Bible with millions and billions of years. These ideas have consequences. They rob Christ of his glory as creator, particularly theistic evolution, because it says that evolution explains everything without God, contradicting Romans 1, where it says that it's clear that there is a creator because of creation. Theistic evolution says, no, there's no evidence for creation. Evolution explains everything. So the second thing is it undermines the goodness of God, because it says that God created a world of death and suffering. Thirdly, it undermines the gospel, because it says that death and suffering and disease were here before Adam sinned. So Adam's sin didn't bring death, suffering, and disease into the world. And then why did Jesus die on the cross to pay for our sin? Why did he heal people? It also undermines our Bible understanding, or hermeneutics, how we understand the Bible, because it says you can't understand it in any sort of a straightforward way. It also undermines the teaching about end times that says there are new heavens and new earth, because the one we live in now has been spoiled because of sin. And because it undermines all these things, it also undermines evangelism, because we're not offering a coherent worldview to somebody that we're trying to share the gospel with. So that, in a nutshell, is by theistic evolution, and the other views actually don't stack up and don't help and are actually anti-Bible.
That's a fantastic answer. Thanks, Don. And thank you, guys, for keeping your answers so short. That's been fantastic. I'm going to throw a woolly one in here because I'm going to go to one from the chat. I'll just bring that up on screen. So it's from Sam. Do you think creation is in the present is governed by purely by physical laws, processes that God created, or do you think that it is miraculously sustained? So I might throw that one over to you, John. I'll just read that again. Do you think creation in the present is governed purely by physical laws, processes that God created, or do you think it is miraculously sustained?
Okay, well, yeah, everything is sustained by force fields, which are really fascinating concepts, but the Bible clearly tells us that God sustains the universe all the time. And I think we know so little about force fields that, to me, this is amazing evidence that there's so much more that we need to know about our universe.
Thanks for that. Okay, we're going to move on with the questions we received during the week. This one is from RJ Dynamo. And this one I'll throw to Don, Don back and forth by the looks of it. But is there evidence of Exodus? I'm assuming it's meaning the Exodus from Egypt.
I take it to mean that. There's a lot of debate amongst Christian archaeologists and Egyptologists and so on about this, but they're coming to a consensus, I believe. One of the problems is that the pharaohs in Egyptian religion, if you named your enemy, then you actually gave them a ticket into the afterlife. So your name was a ticket to the afterlife. So consequently, in the records in Egypt, there's no record of any of the enemies of Egypt or anybody that defeated them at any time, or anybody who caused any trouble at any time is not recorded. And also, there's strong evidence that they were subject to lying about their exploits. So a pharaoh would never admit in their records that they were subject to a whole lot of slaves leaving the country, or plagues, or anything like that that might detract from their glory and splendor. So looking for evidence in the Egyptian records is fraught with difficulty. You also had the problem of the confused chronology of Egypt and so on. But if we start with the Bible, 1446 BC, give or take 1 year, is the date of the Exodus. And then you start looking in Egypt for syncreties. You do find in the 18th dynasty pretty good lineup of who that pharaoh might have been. And so we have the Bible's record, very clear record, a lot of details. Clearly the Exodus happened. And there's an article on our website which has been posted there in the chat box, creation.com Egypt Chronology by Gary Bates, and it's called Framing the Issues. Very, very good article about the difficulties in this, but also pointing to a solution. We also have the videos, the documentaries by American guys, a whole series of them on the Exodus and on searching for Moses, and these are different titles for them. They're also excellent in lining up a solution, a potential solution to this question of, say, who the Pharaoh of the Exodus was. Yeah. I recommend those articles. We also have a new booklet out, which is called Tour Egypt, which has been done for our special tours of Egypt that are coming up in September. This is what it looks like, Tour Egypt. And that's got a very good article in it about who the Pharaoh of the Exodus could have been, probably was. So I recommend that to you.
Fantastic. So we're going to stick with the idea of archaeology, and I'll put this one across to you, John. Can you tell us more about the Ebla tablets? What date were they? And as David mentioned, apparently it might have been around the 10th century. So if you could just elaborate on that, that'd be fantastic.
Okay. So the Ebla tablets are quite controversial, and it's quite interesting. These were a whole lot of tablets that were discovered, I think, under a palace in Nineveh, and they refer to the Syrian period there, and maybe earlier. Now, one of the things that they claim to have referred to is the towns of Sodom and Gomorrah, and so these tablets went back a long period of time. There's dispute over how far back they go. Some of them say they go back to the time of Abraham, and some of them in more recent times. I don't know that they mention David. I haven't read that. But what makes them controversial is the fact that, according to the original translator, Giovanni Patanini, who was the professor at Rome that was an expert in that particular language at the time, the World Authority, when he originally translated the writing, the hieroglyphs, he translated them as a number of towns that were mentioned in the Bible. And of course, Sodom and Gomorrah are only mentioned in the Bible. And as soon as this came out, there was a tremendous amount of flack and denial that there could be any historical record of those towns. And if you Google it now, you can talk about the Ebla controversy and how it's essentially closed. But what happened was that Giovanni was taken off that project, and another professor took over who was very adamant that there was no mention of the Bible in these tablets. But if you look up his record, if you look up his training, his area, it's in the area of Turkey where the Hittites were. Totally different language. And he then took over the translation and denied that there was any references to the Bible. Now, it's interesting, years ago I was researching this area, and I think the work was published in the Biblical Archaeology Reviews, and the original issue of that review was taken offline. I could find all the other issues. I couldn't find that particular issue where Giovanni originally published his work, but a lecturer at Monash had been to his lectures and put up the details of the paper. Giovanni later went on and published all his work in full under Johns Hopkins University Press. And one of the things that he comments on in the discussion is that he pointed out that there seems to be an overwhelming pressure to deny or eliminate any archaeological evidence that confirms the ancient historical accuracy of the Bible.
Wow. Okay, there's another question from Otrevinia. I hope I haven't butchered that name too much. And we'll put it back to you, John, as well, so I'll stay with you. But what pharaoh, let me bring the question up. What pharaoh is in the time of Abraham in history? What is his name? And is there any extra biblical evidences? So do we know who the pharaoh was?
Yeah, sure. Okay, so we notice in the early chapters of the Bible, like in with Moses and so forth, the pharaohs aren't named. They're named in the later, history of the Bible, but not back then. And we also, from secular history, don't have very consistent, very early records of who the pharaohs were. But the Bible talks about the land of Ham. So Ham, of course, was one of Noah's sons. So we know that his descendants moved there. Of course, Egypt, it's just the Greek translation of Mizraim, which was one of Ham's sons, Noah's grandson. And so Mizraim is linked with being the founder of Egypt. Matter of fact, you go to Egypt, you have the Bank of Mizra and the Mizra Insurance Company and so forth. And so Egypt is actually named after Noah's grandson. This is pretty powerful stuff. Now, if we look at Abraham, I think, was about the 9th generation born after the flood in that family. So if we had a list of pharaohs or descendants back to Mizraim, and of course, Menetho's history does run back and state that Mizraim was the first founder of Egypt. If we went roughly from 10 generations, that would give us about the time that we'd be looking at, I guess. That's one piece of evidence. There is also another extra biblical account by Josephus where he claims that it was Abraham who took the knowledge of astronomy and mathematics to Egypt. Now, if this is correct, and we don't know Josephus's sources and how reliable or accurate they are, one of the things that we could look for was some sort of evidence of a sudden learning of astronomy and mathematics in Egypt. And this might be reflected, for example, I think some of the early pyramids aren't astronomically aligned, whereas suddenly we find some of the pyramids are astronomically aligned. So these sort of things can give us clue, but there's so much controversy over Egyptian history that we can't, in my view, be too dogmatic about anything. One thing we can rely on, though, is that the Bible account is standing up.
That's great. Thanks, John. Okay, so we're going to move on to a little bit of anthropology now. So I'll hand over to Don. What is CMI's current stance? Let me just bring that up. What is CMI's current stance on the KNMER 1470 fossil? And this is a question from Stephen. Yeah. Question number 7. What is CMI's current stance on the KNMER 1470 fossil?
Oh, you jumped something. Hang on, what have we got here? You've jumped around. Oh, maybe I didn't have slides for that. You're right. Okay, that's all right. Okay, that was what I had written on my notes. The KNMER 1470 was heralded with great excitement many years ago when it was posted, but it was reconstructed with a very flat face and supposedly from millions of years ago, and it was great excitement because this was human-like. So we have an ape man, if you like. However, it was a very fragmented skull, and more recently, 2018, there was a paper published where some anthropologists actually reconstructed the face using a forensics approach of looking at the muscle attachments and things, and reassembled and found that using this more objective way of assembling the pieces, they discovered that it was quite prognathic. In other words, the jaw was protruding like an ape, not a flat face like a human. So the 1470 has become much more ape-like with further study, and it seems like it's basically just an Australopithecine and nothing special. And certainly the evidence is pointing towards it just being another Australopithecine, Lucy's type. And by the way, there was a study done years ago by Sir Charles Oxnard, another objective study where he looked at all the measurements of the fossils that are available with Lucy's kind, the Australopithecines, looked at compared with the chimps, compared with the humans, because they're supposed to be intermediate between humans and chimps, being our common ancestor or something along the lines like that, or on the way from become us from common ancestor with a chimp. So what Oxnard found from his numerical analysis, though, was that the Australopithecine fossils were not intermediate between chimps and humans, but were out in a different direction. So there were not some sort of transitional form between humans and chimps. So that's it briefly about 1470. There was a paper published by our in-house paleoanthropologist, which is Dr. Peter Lyon, fairly recently, which gave quite a few details about 1470. I think it might have been posted. One of our, yes, early Homo, one of the It's posted there in the chat box. If you read that, you'll get more information about 1470.
Thanks, Don. Okay, we'll stick in anthropology, and I'll stick with you, Don, as well. Another question from Stephen. What is CMI's take on the sea lamb fossil foot bones? Not many creation sites mention it.
Well, if you search creation.com, you'll find there is one article which actually mentions it, gives a fair bit of information. But the sea lamb fossil was a juvenile Australopithecine. And the interesting thing is that it has some foot bones. So, of course, Lucy doesn't have foot bones, so missing. But then they found the Laetoli footprints, and they then said, oh, these must have been made by Lucy's kind, because humans weren't around then. So therefore they concluded that Lucy had human-like feet, because the Laetoli footprints are very human-like. In fact, there are, you would say they're human. A person without shoes walked along there in the mud and made those footprints. So there was great excitement when this juvenile was found, and originally they published a description of everything but the feet, and then more recently the feet have been published. And I suspect the reason the feet weren't published earlier was because they're a bit of an embarrassment, because they don't really fit the story that Australopithecines had human-like feet, because the big toe on the feet actually is movable for grabbing onto branches. And of course, human feet, your big toe, you can't grab onto things with it. It's fixed straight. So this juvenile doesn't really fit the story. So again, there's some information about it on the website. So look at Salam, and you'll find more information about it. There's an article in National Geographic, and I'm pretty sure what I read of it, they were trying to play down the fact that it didn't match what they expected, and it makes Lucy's kind even more ape-like. They try to explain this by saying that juveniles were less human in Lucy's kind, but in all other apes, the juveniles are actually more human-like. So they went right against the trend in all the other apes in trying to argue that this juvenile Australopithecine was less human-like because juveniles were less human-like. It doesn't add up. So a lot of storytelling goes on here, but the bottom line is it doesn't help their case one little bit.
Yeah. Thanks for that, Don. I'd like to throw a question to John now. Another question from Octravigny, and I'll just bring that up for you. Could you comment about the oldest house in Britain, apparently 11,500 years old, which obviously goes before the flood if we go by those dates. So, John, how would you comment on that?
Yeah, sure. Okay. Well, I mean, there's lots of dates and claims about, things being very old in history, the conventional dates for the pyramids and lots of other structures, Chinese history and different other things. Even here in Australia, we have different sites that are dated back, 40,000 years and this sort of thing. So there's obviously a clear discrepancy between secular dating of these things and the biblical date. So how do we look at this? Okay, well, a couple of things. A lot of the biblical dating, of course, secular dating, when they date the timbers, so they found some timbers that were frames of what they believed with this house, and they found some stone tools. So the Stone Age has a particular time frame going back, a long period of time, maybe 100,000 or a million years even. I think they're stretching it one way and ending, about 3,500 years ago or somewhere in there. So if they find some stone tools, they'll put it into that age. The other thing they do, of course, is carbon-14 dating. And of course, we know there's major problems with carbon-14 dating because we don't know what the original level of carbon-14 was at the time. Carbon-14 levels depend on the cosmic ray flux from outer space. It also depends on the strength of the Earth's magnetic field that repels the cosmic rays. And so it also depends on the total concentration of carbon in the atmosphere at the time and so forth. So there's so many things. So they have to calibrate those dates against other known dates, but there aren't known prehistorical dates to be able to reliably calibrate these things. So they don't have reference materials to calibrate these methods once they go back before known historical dates. So it becomes a very open area. Let me tell you a story that started me off in my research in this area a long time ago when I was a research fellow in the chemistry department at the University of Tasmania back in the early 70s. One of my friends was doing his doctorate in geochemistry, and he had a European shovel handle that was partly petrified, partly turned to stone and partly timber. So he decided to have the timber section carbon-14 dated. And I still remember him showing me the results from the government research labs that had done the carbon-14 dating. And it was 6,600 years. And I remember we looked at ourselves now, how could this European shovel handle be 6,600 years? Was the oak tree or whatever it was made from, that old? So it certainly drove home the whole problem of dating. Another thing is, if you look at if you sort of go online and Google, do a search on the latest calibration curve, say from Cornell University, you'll find that even for the known historical dates, for a number of historical dates, the same level of carbon-14 can correspond to several historical dates that might be hundreds of years apart. So this just clearly demonstrates the wide fluctuations that can occur in the issues. On the other hand, however, there are a number of known chronologies that have been reported, not too many. For example, the oldest Chinese chronology that has been preserved is commonly known as the Bamboo Annals. And that goes back and says that and recorded that China was founded about just under 2,000 years BC. And this was an actual ancient Chinese chronology that was preserved because a lot of their records were destroyed around the year 0 or 1 AD, this sort of thing, by a Chinese emperor. It had a lot of records burnt. There was another set of records of astronomical calculations that were handed to Alexander the Great when he went to Babylon there by the astronomers there that they say dated back to the founding of Babylon. And when you calculate the dates back that they gave, it actually gives a date for the founding of Babylon not that long after the flood, in the order of about 100 years or so after the flood. Similarly, there are other historical records that give a foundation for when Egypt started. These are ancient chronologies that have been preserved. And the fascinating thing that I found was, and we have them for the foundation of Greece, we have them for the foundation of Egypt, they all come back to that time just after the date of the biblical flood. So what we have here is preserved chronologies that say that these civilizations of essentially Europe, Egypt, and China and Babylon all started after the flood. Where do we get the older ages from? We get them from these carbon-14 dates and also people wanting to push back ages. But the other fascinating thing is if you, for example, look at, say, some of the dates here in Australia of 40,000 years for people and this sort of thing. If we carbon-14 date the soft tissue that we find in dinosaurs, in the giant marine reptiles and this sort of thing, they all come out around about 25,000 years, and this is work done, say, by the University of Lund in Sweden, this sort of thing. They don't make a big issue of publishing these dates, though. But these are the same carbon-14 dates. So clearly there's a major problem with our dating system. A lot more could be said, but I think the growing evidence is when we look at what we can know, what we can measure and verify, it's certainly confirming the young age of the post-flood era.
Oh, fantastic. That's very in-depth. Thank you, John. I'm going to throw a couple of very quick questions at you before we go for just a very short break. So if we can get through these next two as quick as you can. So the first one was from Jacob, and I've just put it in as an edited comment, but how does the Epic of Gilgamesh relate to the Genesis account?
Oh, okay. I'll take this one. So there's a very good article on this on the Creation Ministries website as well. And just in reference to something I said earlier, for example, the bamboo annals, there was a very good article on this in the Encyclopedia Britannica. So the references for these sort of chronologies are out there if you do Google searches on them. If we come now to this, the question about the Gilgamesh epic, as I said, a very good explanation of the possible scenarios. So the scenarios as claimed is that, well, this is an older record, that the biblical account was copied from this record, and therefore, you know, everything is sort of made up. So the story is that a particular hero goes off in search of the survivor for the flood, and talks to him, or finds this survivor of the Great Flood, and hence this survivor tells him the story. But it's fascinating if we look at some of the data. The flood was only involved rain. It only went for about 6 days. The vessel that they were saved in was a cube. You know, a lot of things. It just reads, from a scientist's point of view, it just reads fairy tale, mythology type of stuff. Whereas when we look at the biblical account, the size and shape of the ark, the fact that the fountains of the deep were opened up, as well as a lot of underground water, much better explanation for the geological evidence that we see. The whole earth was covered with water. When you look at the geological evidence at the rate at which we find that got the earth's crust, and on the very surface of the earth crust there's this very thin layer of sedimentary deposited material that covers most of the earth. You know, it just fits the flood scenario. Even the geologists, they've got about 5 marine extinction events that occurred. They just spread them out over hundreds of millions of years. But of course, that all fits the day that there was one global flood at that time. And of course, the Gilgamesh epic probably refers to a local flood. So really, the Gilgamesh epic just doesn't stand up, and it makes quite common sense that both accounts are an attempt to recount a factual, one is an account of a factual event that happened, and the other one has been a much blurred, passed down, fantasized account of what's happened. So the biblical account really stands up in my view.
Okay, so one final question before we go to a very quick break. And I'll throw this to Don, and it's actually one of our chat questions. So I'll just bring it up so that you can read it as well. So can you please outline how the differences in races come about? Was this primarily a genetic difference between Shem, Ham, and Japheth? And if so, how is it that we have such stark differences in appearance between racial groups? And that's from Peter.
There's a chapter in the Answers book about this, chapter 19, I think it is, about where the races come from. It's too much to go into a lot of depth here because we'll gobble up a lot of time. But the Bible actually tells us that we're all closely related because just 4,500 years ago, there was Noah and his wife and his 3 sons and their wives. Those 6 people gave rise to all the people on earth today, which means that it doesn't matter whether you're red, yellow, black, or white. We all came from Noah and his family just 4,500 years ago. That would suggest close genetic similarity. And according to evolution, we had separate development over huge periods of time, and therefore there'd be big differences between the so-called races, and a lot of racism was justified by this sort of thinking. But modern genetics has caught up with the Bible, and modern genetics shows us that the difference between the so-called races are tiny genetically. Although we may think that they look major, we look at somebody's, oh, their skin's black, you know, mine's white, you know, there's such a big difference, but we all have the same skin color. It's called melanin. It's a pigment, in our skin, and if you have a lot of it, you're dark. If you don't have much of it, you're pale, and everything else in between. So the so-called differences are not actually, they're just differences of amounts rather than differences in kind. We also are programmed to notice differences, otherwise we would be confused about everything. If you walked into a room and noticed everything every time you walked into it, it would be overloading for you, but you only notice the things that are different. And so it is with people. We look at somebody and we notice the things that are different. And so we tend to accentuate differences. We don't look at somebody else and say, oh, they've got 2 ears, a nose, and 2 eyes, and a mouth. Of course they have. We only see the differences. And so we tend to, in our psychology, overemphasize the differences because that's what we use to actually tell each other apart, to distinguish one person from another. But look up there's a lot of stuff on this on creation.com, but look up the chapter in the Answers book. I'm pretty sure it's chapter 19. I think it's been, probably somebody's posted it there. Somebody's lent on their key on their keyboard, David Brook, by the look of it. So there's somebody will post a link there which will link to that chapter.
That's great. And the Answers book is available online for free, I believe. Just the chapters have been posted to the creation.com website, if memory serves me correctly. But you can also buy
well, the
PDF versions of it, yeah.
The PDF chapters are all there, but we're progressively putting up the chapters from the beginning in HTML format, so they're sort of easy to read on the screen.
That's great. So I'm going to give you gentlemen a quick break, just to grab a drink of water. We'll be back in a minute, so it's only going to be a minute, but we'll throw up a video. So as we take a short break, don't go anywhere, and we'll be right back.
Stromatolites are regarded by many as the oldest fossils on Earth. They are interpreted as the remains of colonies of blue-green algae, or more accurately, cyanobacteria. The oldest ones are claimed to be 3.5 billion years old. Within this evolutionary perspective, one would expect these colonies to have radically changed, but remarkably, they are essentially the same today. Stromatolites, therefore, are classic examples of living fossils. Living fossils cause major problems for evolution because they provide stunning examples of how evolution hasn't occurred. They also call into question the evolutionary time frame. Some people try to downplay the significance of living fossils by arguing that when something is well adapted to its environment, it doesn't need to change. But this would need the environment to be constant for the supposed period of time. This argument cannot apply to stromatolites because during 3.5 billion years of alleged evolutionary time, many radical environment changes supposedly occurred, including the arrival of new predators and parasites.
To find out more from Creation Ministries International, visit our website, creation.com.
And welcome back. We're going to skip a question, question 11. We're going to go straight into question 12 for Don. So Don, here's one about the ice cores. How do ice core layers relate to dating? This one's from Jacob. So I know you've got some slides to go with that. So excellent. I'll let you get those ready. But I'll just read that question again. Ice core layers, how does it relate to dating?
Okay, so again, a big topic, and it's quite complex when you go into it. But the bottom line is that the amount of ice in Greenland and Antarctica, where the ice core dating is done, is consistent with it forming since the flood. If you take into account just the current rate of snowfall, the Greenland ice sheet could form in just 5,000 years, while the Antarctic ice sheet would take only 10,000 years. And yet the Antarctic ice sheet's dated at up to 1 million years. But the thing is that the current rate of snowfall would be much, much less than the amount post-flood, because after the flood, the conditions are just right for enormous snowfall, because the oceans are warm, the volcanic activity blocks out the sun. In fact, it's very difficult to get any sort of an ice age by the long age approach. And they they have all sorts of theories about how you get an ice age, but none of them work. But the flood gives us a mechanism for an ice age, one ice age after the flood. And so this is the reality, just to cut it a long way short. But you can only count annual layers in the top part of the Greenland ice sheet. The rest of it is guesstimation. And when you go to Antarctica, the amount of snowfall is not sufficient to see annual layers. And so consequently, they use all sorts of correlations with seafloor sediments and a thing called Milankovitch cycles, which are the real cycle of the way this Earth moves around the sun in a cyclic manner, and that makes the Earth a little bit warmer, a little bit cooler. And then they have this imagined scenario where CO2 comes off the oceans when it's warmed up a little bit by this Milankovitch cycle, and then that CO2 amplifies the warming effect, and this comes out of an ice age, and then the opposite goes the other way. But that's where a lot of this scaremongering about global warming with CO2 comes from. In fact, there's misunderstanding of how an ice age forms and the inability to even account for any ice age. But it's interesting, if you look at the amount of snowfall that occurs even today, this is in Japan, how much snow can fall. And you can see in this Tateyama Karobi alpine route in Japan, 18 meters of snow. And this is today. The amount of snow falling after the flood as the ice age developed would have been quite high, and account for all the ice that we find in the world today. When you look at the cores from Antarctica, this is the 3 cores that have been done, there's something very fishy about the cores. The horizontal lines there represent the ash from volcanic activity, tephra, the fallout of ash from volcanic activity. You can see there's quite a bit in the top part, but as you get down into the bottom part, there's almost none. So anybody going to tell me that, over that huge period of time, up to 1 million years, that the vast majority of it, there was no volcanic activity, and yet in the latter part of it, there's quite a bit. That indicates the fallacy of this extension of these things way down here into this deep time scenario. There are a number of resources available from our web store. Frozen in Time by Michael Lord, Ice Cores in the Age of the Earth by Dr. Larry Varhutman, and there's also a documentary, very good documentary there, which you can get by video download. And there's also a chapter in the Answers book, What About the Ice Age, which goes into some details about this as well.
That's fantastic. Thanks, Don. That's fantastic. I'm going to throw another question to you from Stephen. This one is, how did plants and trees survive after the flood, and how quickly did they grow back?
Yeah, well, the first record of a plant growing after the flood is when Noah sent out the bird that brought back a twig from an olive tree. Remember that? And we think, well, how was that growing? Well, the ark ran aground quite some months before it was they were able to get off the ark. And the reason that is that there's mud everywhere. So they had to wait for the land to dry out. And at that stage, they sent out the bird, and it brought back the twig from the olive tree. And that was, if you like, an indication to Noah that things were revegetating generally. And soon they were able to get off the ark. But the thing is that many plants can survive, of course, from seed, but also broken pieces of timber. You've got floating log mats and things like this. You've got plants that are taken on the ark for the purpose of feeding animals. Noah, I imagine, would have also taken on board seed of various important plants, which at least he would have seen as important for growing crops after the flood. You also have burrs in the coats of the animals. A lot of plants produce burrs, which latch onto the coats of animals. Even things like clover, there's clover burr. there's lots of different ways in which plants could survive the flood, and not all did, I might add. There are plants, of course, which are now extinct that didn't survive the flood.
And talking about extinction, here's a question from Mary, and I'll throw this one to you, John. How is it decided that something is extinct?
Well, I'm certainly not an expert in this, but I did live in Tasmania for a few years. And of course, it's famous for the Tasmanian tiger becoming extinct. And of course, a lot of people didn't want to believe that. And there's possibly some people who hope thinly that it might still be alive. But I guess if there's no sightings for a long period of time, it's classified as extinct. I don't know whether there's any official position. But of course, we often, thankfully, hear stories of something being not sighted for a long period of time, and then it is sighted.
Yeah.
I think generally, if it's not reported in the scientific literature anymore and people aren't observing it, scientists, then it would probably go on the extinction list.
And,
The interesting thing is that actually there are actually discovering animals and plants and things that have been thought to be extinct. They're being discovered all the time, alive.
Mm.
Wallenby pines would be one locally. Mm.
Yep.
Mm. And thought to be extinct for millions of years. That's like the coelacanth and
Wallenby pine. Yeah.
Staying on the extinction jag, I'll throw a question to you, Don. How did all the sea dinosaurs, like Leviathan, die out?
Haven't got a clue.
This one's from Octravenia as well.
Haven't got a clue. Well, actually, it's a mystery for everybody to explain why a whole group of animals would become extinct. And the same with the dinosaurs. Why did they become extinct? I mean, the meteor impact theory is the most popular idea, but it's not the only one. There are many other ideas about why dinosaurs became extinct. And of course, as we've already mentioned, there are things becoming extinct all the time. But of course, the marine dinosaurs weren't on the ark, only the land animals were on the ark. And it may well have been that the conditions during the flood were just not suitable for them to survive. That's a possibility. It could have been after the flood that the conditions weren't suitable for them to survive, particularly during the Ice Age. But there's also things like genetic entropy, which is the toll of mutations on organisms. So mutations are destroying us, they're destroying all animals, and some particular groups of animals may well have been more susceptible to mutations. That is, they had less efficient error correcting systems, for example, and therefore they ended up becoming extinct because of genetic decay. But we don't know. We underline, we don't know because we weren't there to see what happened. We can only guess what happened.
Thanks for that. I'm going to go in a completely different direction here. And Jonathan, who's the producer, if you wouldn't mind just keeping us all up on screen, just for this little section here. I just wanted to know, what's your guys' favorite articles to write? This is a question from Evan. What are your favorite articles to write? So Don,
John's written a couple of books, so he's sort of got runs on the board too. I've written many articles, and I'd have to say, just on the basis of the number of people that have read the article, this is another question later, but the sort of articles, I like articles about the age of things. Like, for example, I wrote one not that long ago about the age of arches in the United States. There's a national park called the Arches National Park in the United States, and there are a couple of thousand rock arches in this park. And it's quite a mystery to the secular geologists as to how the arches form. But it's an even bigger mystery that every year or two, one of them falls over. And they're supposed to have been there for millions of years. And yet every year or so, one of them collapses We don't have any new ones appearing to replace the ones that are collapsing. And it's a very neat clock. It's a very neat clock that points to the flood being the source of the arches. And of course, the extinction of the arches in a couple of 2,500 years since the flood matches the data.
Mm.
So that was an exciting one for me to write that. Just a simple one-page article. Those of you who subscribe to Creation magazine would have seen this. Those of you who don't subscribe might have missed out. So there's a plug for Creation magazine. But also, so the ones about the age of things I like. But of course, I like the ones about the design in living things as well. So Jonathan Safdie likes to write those, but I like those articles about the design in living things and how they speak about the divine designer. Super intelligent designer, way above our ability, I might add.
Mm. And Jonathan, John, same question to you. What's your favourite article to write?
Well, I had a passion for a long period of time to write on the growing evidence for creation. And so I was able to put out my book, Evolution Impossible, 12 Reasons Why Evolution Cannot Explain the Origin of Life on Earth. And I think one of the areas that is fascinating to me is this whole concept of evolution that is being taught to our young people, as was described in one of the promotional videos at the beginning, that young people are being told that the extreme complexity of the biochemistry that we see in living things could arise by chance. And I think what happens is it is just so complex that that the human mind can't grasp it. But to sort of try and simplify it, you have a scenario where somehow non-living chemicals formed great big long polymers which are unstable, right? In organic polymers joined by carbon bonds are not all that stable in the environment, but somehow millions of identical molecules formed of all different types. And these giant molecules, millions of them, happen to just come together and form a structure that then contained hundreds of different complex chemicals, which also formed, which are very difficult to produce in the laboratory by experienced chemists, but somehow they form naturally in nature by themselves, all happen to be in the right spot and formed in this cell, formed in this envelope. And then this really long, complex molecule that we now call DNA formed that encoded and described the structure that had formed randomly around it. And even if that did happen, right, and, we don't have to have done an applied maths degree in statistics to know that that's absolutely impossible. These things don't happen. We don't observe them in the laboratory. Well, the chemistry involved is extremely difficult to do. I think I forget how many years I've spent studying chemistry at university and researching in this area. And people expect that these reactions happen. But even if that did happen, it still wouldn't work because you would need a code reader to read the DNA code, the ribosome. And the structure of a ribosome involves over 300,000 atoms arranged in a particular structure to be able to read the language in the DNA and then reassemble the proteins from materials coming on. And so all this arranged, so a specific code reader arose that read the code, that had self-written down the destruction of all the things that had just formed around it to make that first living cell. And this is what we're teaching our kids. We don't teach them that happened. We just say it must have happened. But to me, it's powerful evidence of a supernatural and incredible creator designer. And then the changes in the genetic codes that occurred, claimed through mutations, produced something new that worked. Every engineer knows we have a team of engineers in at work building machines, and it takes teams of engineers. They build prototypes, they don't work properly, they've got to modify them. And we're expecting that these chemical reactions that don't occur in nature naturally somehow all occurred and produced new mutations, produced new code that produced more even fantastic organisms. And to me, it just really irks me that we are continuing to teach this to our children, despite the overwhelming evidence from biochemistry that evolution is absolutely impossible.
Yep.
So you got me worked up there.
Yeah. And John's book is available from Creation Ministries International from our store. Evolution Impossible. It's available from our store. Yeah, recommended.
Yeah, I've just actually started reading it myself. So yeah, it's a good read. So Don, I'm going to throw a question to you. What is your favorite article in any of our magazines? Creation Magazine, a question by Worm. So what is your favorite article?
Well, out of 10,000 articles, you asked me for the favorite. Well, of the ones I've written, the one that's proven to be a favorite with most people is one called Who Created God? And over 1 million people have read that article. So, or at least have read it on the website. People may have shared it with even more people have read it, but at least 1 million people have read that article. Who Created God? I'd have to say that's my favorite, just because it's a favorite with most people.
So keeping with that theme, what is the evidence for God's existence? It's a question put by Aaron. Do we have evidence for God's existence?
Oh, indeed so. Let me get some slides up. Is that the next thing on the list? Evidence for God. Yeah, that is the next one. Okay, very quickly. This is a huge topic, but let's dive into it. First, we have the evidence from creation. John's just been talking about that in terms of the biochemistry of living things, for example. But Romans chapter 1, verse 20 tells us that no one has any excuse for saying that the Creator does not exist, because it's evident from the creation. So what he has created reveals that he exists. We also have, I've started there not because it's the most important, but because it's available to everybody. So everybody can see that there's a creator. Even in Japan, preschool children, in Japan they don't have a concept of creator for the adults, but preschool children believe there must be some unseen creator who created everything. It's part of logic and reason. And then we have the Bible. The Bible, I'll go into that in a couple of minutes about why I say that. We have Jesus' life, death and resurrection, and I'll go into that, and also the miracles in the Bible. This is an example of some of the biotechnology in living things. This is an animation of a motorized delivery system called kinesin or kinesin within living cells. This is all cells with a nucleus have this, and they deliver parcels of proteins where they need it in the cell. So proteins are manufactured, then they're packaged up. They have an address label on them to say where they're to go to. They're packaged up with like ones to go to the same address, and they're delivered to the site where they need to be assembled, perhaps into another machine, for example. And this is an amazing delivery system. It's 125,000 steps in a millimeter. So this is nanotechnology of an amazing kind. And it uses an energy compound for each step. That's just the tip of the iceberg in terms of the technology. This is stuff that reveals the amazing intelligence of the creator who made this, who coded the DNA to create this. And then we have the Bible, the divinely inspired as evidenced by the Bible. So we see the amazing unity of the Bible, the amazing preservation of the Bible, its historical accuracy being proven over and over and over again in spite of the skeptics, the scientific accuracy, in terms of historical accuracy. John mentioned some of the archaeological discoveries. You know, people said, for example, the Hittites never existed because there was no archaeological evidence. The Bible talked about it, and then eventually they found the archaeological evidence. The scientific accuracy, which we've touched upon a little bit, but we go into a lot more evidence. The prophetic accuracy, prophecies regarding Jesus that will fulfill, and other things as well. The skeptics have said that prophecies must have been written after the event, But then the Dead Sea Scrolls were found and found that Isaiah was written before Jesus came, and so they were written before he came. The civilizing influence of the Bible, and its absolute honesty. As the civilizing influence is interesting. There was a secular anthropologist in one of the Pacific Island nations, and he was said to this chap who had a big cauldron there making up some soup, and he said to him, "What's the book you're reading?" He said, "I'm reading the Bible." And the secular atheist anthropologist said, "Oh, that's rubbish. We don't. If you know anything about anything, you don't believe the Bible anymore." And anyway, the chap said, that was making the soup, he said, "Sir, if it wasn't for this book, you would be in the pot." If it wasn't for this book, you would be in the pot. And so the civilizing influence of the Bible. And then it's a life-transforming message, as many testify to how they've been transformed by the Bible's message. Also, God is revealed in Jesus Christ. Jesus claimed to speak as God. He did the things that only God can do. He was either a liar, a lunatic, or he should be your Lord. And C.S. Lewis made that distinction. A liar, he conned people, or he's a lunatic thinking he was God, or he actually was who he said he was, in which case he should be your Lord. And then there's the resurrection. The resurrection, the tomb was empty, and the resurrection is the only valid explanation. Many a person set out to try and disprove the resurrection, ended up becoming a Christian. So the Christian ends up knowing God, not just a theoretical idea in the head. For as it says in Romans chapter 8, for all who are led by the Spirit of God are sons of God, children of God. For you did not receive the spirit of slavery to fall back into fear, but you have received the spirit of adoption as sons, as children of God, by whom we cry, Abba, Father. The Spirit himself bears witness with our spirit that we are the children of God. And so the Christian has this relationship with God through what the Bible teaches us and through all this evidence. And I just skipped over a whole lot of things there, just giving you dot points. But read the chapter in the Answers book, Does God Exist? It goes into more detail about each of those points.
That's fantastic, Don. I'm going to skip a couple of questions now. There was a couple of questions that came in regarding the flat Earth. I'm just going to skip those tonight, but if my colleagues can put the links to there's some articles on our website that cover those in enough depth to answer those questions. So I'm sorry for those who put the questions in. We're just running out of time. I just want to get to a couple of the other bigger questions. So the next question I'm going to run with is sort of on the opposite end of that one where you just mentioned, Don. It's what is one of the best atheist or evolutionist arguments, and how do you combat it? So I'll throw that to John first, and then I might come back to you, Don, just for that same question. Is there an argument that the evolutionists or atheists uses that's sort of the biggest one that you hear most of the time?
Yes, well, I wouldn't necessarily say it's a good argument, but I think the radiometric dating claim of long ages for life on Earth seems to be the one that, in my experience, talking with Christians that have given over to some sort of theistic evolution or their faith has become weakened. And I think this is a great shame. So it's in the area of the radiometric dating. One of the things I like to just quickly point out in that area is that with radiometric dating, we're doing chemical analysis, usually with a mass spectrometer of particular isotopes. And we've measured the half-life of those isotopes. And so on the basis of the concentrations, we do calculations and calculate the age of a particular rock. But one of the very important things, and for many years I served as the chief chemist for an organisation that was registered with the National Association of Testing Authorities. So that meant that our chemical analysis would stand up in court. In order to have that recognition and registration, we had to, we had a lot of calibration, but we had reference standards that we had to use and to check, and our equipment had to be calibrated, and our methods had to be checked independently, again using reference standards and known samples. So one of the important things is that when we come to radiometric dating, there are no reference rocks. We don't have this rock is 10 million years old, this rock's 30 million years old, this rock's 200 million years old, to test and to calibrate our methods. And one of the things that I've read in the literature, it seems that for the same rocks, we can get different ages depending on the combination of radiometric elements that we use, radioactive elements that we use. And this again should raise alarm bells. There's so many inconsistencies there. And when we look at the big picture, radiometric time clock methods are not the only way we can estimate ages. We can estimate ages from erosion rates, for example. And we have a lot of data from geography, geographical studies and so forth that give us erosion rates. And we essentially know, and this published literature in the secular mainstream journals, that continents will essentially erode away in less than 10 million years. So that's just a simple example of there's so many inconsistencies that are saying there's something wrong with this method. When we look at the other evidence that we have, of course, that we're finding now, soft tissues in dinosaurs and these sort of things, the decline in the strength of the Earth's magnetic field, there's a whole lot of other things that we can measure today, now reproducibly measure, that are pointing to a very young age for our Earth. And so I think for most people who are going into these other areas, it's all very complex. And we're still teaching this bottom line that, radiometric dating is the answer to the problems. And that, unfortunately, is still being spoken of as the main mantra against creation.
Yeah. And Don, I'll throw that same question to you as well. A question from Lydia. What is one of the best atheist or evolution arguments that you come across, and how do you counter it?
Again, I'd agree with John. There's not necessarily a good argument, but a very common argument is, how can you believe in a loving God when there's so much suffering in the world? But the question presupposes that God created a world of death and suffering. In other words, it presupposes that image of theistic evolution, as I put up earlier, that death, suffering and disease have always been here ever since the world came into being, or ever since life came into being, and God is responsible for it. But of course, if we take the Bible's history in a straightforward manner, then sin is a cause of death, disease and suffering. It's not the way God created it. And so this is where it's so important to have a proper biblical view of origins, because we then have an answer to questions like, why is there death and suffering if God is good?
Yeah, thanks, Don. I'm going to go to a live question now. It's in the same area, so I thought it'd be a good time to bring it in. It's sort of a flip side of the questions that have just been asked. So I'll post it to you, Don, first. Are there any recent discoveries in any field from a creation point of view that you're excited about, that we should know about, providing support for biblical creation?
Definitely. The area of genetics is proving to be a very powerful field of affirmation of the Bible's history. There was a paper published a few years ago called The Waiting Time Problem, that had a subtitle, but it was by Dr. John Sanford and a couple of other authors, published in a secular journal. And it's called The Waiting Time Problem, and it refers to how long you'd have to wait to get mutations lined up in a human-like creature to affect an evolutionary change from a chimp-like creature, or common ancestor of a chimp, to a human, and which is supposed to have taken 7 million years or so, according to the evolutionary story. So what they found is, using assumptions in the modeling of the genetics, which is all possible these days, using straightforward mainstream assumptions, in fact making assumptions which make evolution even possible, they found that it took 84 million years to get just 2 mutations lined up on the way to becoming a human. What's the difference between a chimp and a human? We're talking about at least 15% difference, which is 450 million letters, 450 million base pairs, and it took 84 million years just to get 2. So this sort of research shows that evolution of a human from an ape-like creature in 7 million years is not just improbable, it's impossible. Totally and absolutely impossible. And there was an article in Creation magazine written by yours truly, which commented on this research that had been done. Again, those who subscribe to Creation magazine would have already seen this, but about 12 months ago, I think I wrote the article, maybe 18 months ago. But that's an exciting area. But also, all of the research being done on human population genetics in the world, comparing our Y chromosome and mitochondrial DNA and all these sorts of things, are all pointing to a time frame and a biblical history with one mother of all humankind, one father of all humankind. And there's many things that are being, and you can find articles on creation.com by Dr. Robert Carter about these. There's really exciting developments in this area.
That's great. We're getting really close to the last run to the end. So what we might do is just take a very quick break. Another minute video just to let you guys have a little bit of a rest, grab a sip of water. So don't go anywhere. We'll be right back after this short break.
Does the human Y chromosome suggest that men are headed for extinction? In 2003, an Oxford University geneticist claimed that the human Y chromosome was crumbling before our very eyes and that the demise of men was imminent. Since this time, other researchers have pointed out that these doomsday predictions were overstated. For instance, the Y chromosome has a unique mechanism for correcting harmful mutations. Nevertheless, the Y chromosome certainly shows signs of overall decay, as do the other chromosomes. Human genetic decay is a real phenomenon, but it flies in the face of evolutionary ideas. According to evolutionists, all the complex coded information in our genomes supposedly arose through a slow accumulation of random changes called mutations. However, what we see with the Y chromosome is that such natural processes consistently degrade the genetic instructions as opposed to create them. Since the time of Adam, we live in a decaying world, just as the Bible says.
To find out more from Creation Ministries International, visit our website, creation.com.
And we're back. So, Don, there's a question for you. It's from Todd, and I'll just bring it up. I've edited the question down. It was quite a lengthy one in the submission. But is there any update regarding Dr. Robert Carter's research on human diversity and the subsequent settlement in Africa? If you're aware of any of that, sort of follows on about the whole genetics arguments, I believe, that Robert Carter's been researching.
Could I suggest, since we're running out of time, that Todd look up the website, because Rob's done videos and biblical genetics on Facebook or YouTube. There's quite a few videos and things there, and articles on the website, articles in the Journal of Creation. If you're subscribed to the Journal of Creation, you sound like you would benefit from that. There are regular articles about these things posted in those areas. So, but yeah, as I just said, it's an exciting area, and there's a lot of good research being done, which backs up the Bible's history.
Okay, I'm going to skip a few questions now. So we're going to go to a question from Hume. Is there any evidence for the existence of nano-sized packages of genetic material? Can it infect other organisms? So I'm guessing this is the germ theory of infection.
Yeah.
Don, did you want to take that, or John?
Just quickly, this is the question. The question is basically comes from thinking that viruses don't cause disease, that something else causes disease. And I really think it's quite unscientific, to put bluntly. There's so much evidence that various viruses cause various diseases. You can, with measles, for example, it's caused by a virus. You get infected with it. The people you're in contact with catch measles, and then you can isolate the virus, the same virus, from those people that catch measles from you. and you can measure the infection rate. People that aren't in contact with somebody who has measles don't get measles. You know, the idea that these diseases are not caused by viruses is just preposterous, to be blunt. But there's a bit of traction given to it by the controversy around lockdowns and things that relate to coronavirus. Again, the coronavirus has been isolated probably millions of times, and it's been sequenced probably millions of times. It's been probably more sequenced than any other virus in history. It's causal as a causal agent for COVID-19. There's absolutely no doubt caused by a virus called SARS-CoV-2, which has been sequenced over and over again. People who have COVID symptoms are positive for the virus. They infect other people who become positive for the virus. Got the rapid antigen test, which tests for the antigens of the virus itself. You can be positive if you're infected with it. The PCR test, polymerase chain reaction test, again, it actually identifies part of the virus to identify that you're infected with it. I mean, the idea that this is not caused by a virus but something else is just without any scientific foundation whatsoever.
Yeah, thanks, Don. We're going to move into the world of geology now, and I'll throw a question to John. Hopefully you can answer this one. Is granite still being made today? Let me just bring that's a question from Tom. So is granite still being made today?
Oh, I suppose if there's, granitic lava flows coming out, so granite's an acid rock. I just remember from geology, you had acid and basic rocks, and a granite is a rock with a high percentage of silica, and then you've got plagioclase and orthoclase. And I remember plagioclase is the white one because it starts with P and it's not pink. Orthoclase is the pink one. Look, I assume that they are, that you could have a granite type lava flow and you can have a basic type lava flow, I assume.
Okay.
We still have lava flows today, volcanic eruptions.
Actually, we would expect that you would get granite flows today, but there aren't any.
Oh, right.
It's actually one of those things which shows that the present is not the key to the past. And the granite that we see in the world formed either during the flood or during creation.
Interesting.
And you would remember the pleochroic halos from polonium, John.
Yes,
that's part of that is showing that the granites actually formed very quickly, very rapidly, and so that's a whole area. Go to creation.com, put in granites, and just see what comes up. There's lots of articles about it.
Excellent. So sticking with geology, I'm going to throw this question to Don. I think you've got some slides, and it's from Peter. And you might need to explain this for me because I put the question in, but I'm not fully aware of what he's talking about. Are you aware of the implications of Newton's and Stokes' laws? And in the question he asked, he said, yes, laws, not guesses, for the claim by creationists that massive amounts of sedimentary rocks were deposited by the flood. So if you can just explain what Stokes' laws is and how that would relate to sedimentation, that'd be fantastic.
Okay, so Jonathan could put up the slides. There's this question 28. You've got it there? Okay. So Stokes, or these laws only apply to spherical particles in still water, and they are not, which don't interact with one another. So the particles have to be sufficiently dilute, is that they don't actually come near each other to influence each other. So the Stokes law, it's to do with the settling of particles in solution or in a fluid. So you've got a particle which is more dense than the fluid, and it moves down through the fluid. So this is the idea, it's this description of Stokes law, and they are laws. but they do only apply to specific situations. Now, the question is, are all the particles in the flood spherical? No. Is it still water? No. And are the particles separated? Well, a lot of the situation would be a slurry of particles traveling in water, and certainly not separated. So the question undoubtedly thinks that deposition of mud, e.g. from deformed shale or alternating shale and sandstone layers, requires still water in a very slow process. In other words, how could it possibly happen during the flood? And when you consider that about half of the sedimentary rocks in the world, that's rocks laid down under water, or in reference to the flood, or it can be windblown. But in this case, we talk about water-laid rocks. But about half the sedimentary rocks are shale, limestone, or mudstone. And he reckons they could not have formed in the flood because of Stokes' law. But as we've said, Stokes' law doesn't apply to the flood. And it's been known for decades that sand deposits in alternating layers from flowing slurries. And there's a paper way back in the journal Creation by Dr. Andrew Snelling, which talked about how nature was finally catching up with creationist research. And the creationist research was by Dr. Guy Berthaud, who refers to a French creationist geologist and his colleagues, published in 1988. So this showed that sand deposits in layers from flowing material. And you can see a demonstration of this, and this was amazing. I was down at the Gold Coast for a surf back in 1995, and I got down to the beach, and there'd been a big tides overnight, which had ripped a lot of sand out of the beach, and had this shelf here, this step down at the beach. And when I looked at it closely, I found that it was layered. These fine laminations were present. And I knew that that sand had been pumped there by a pumping process. So the beach has been eroded, and the government had been paying for sand to be dredged from the river down south and then brought up by ship and then pumped onto the beach to rescue the beaches from being destroyed by the tides and the big surfs and things when there's a cyclone. And so here we have, this is actually, from memory, I think I said 8,000 tons of sand per load, and it was pumped onto the beach in a slurry of 70% water and 30% sand in about an hour. So this material was deposited here on this beach in a fraction of an hour. And all these layers here can be seen forming in a fraction of an hour. So what about the idea that when you see these layers in rocks around the world, they represent thousands of years or hundreds of years of slow, one little line per year, this sort of idea, it doesn't stack up at all. And also mud deposits from flowing waters. They're not just sand. So the experiment's been done with a flume tank where you flow the mud in water, and they've shown that mud will deposit in the same fashion, forming layers from flowing material. And there's a couple of articles there that people can look up on creation.com, which refer to the original secular research that was done that shows this. So our question comes from an out-of-date thinking, actually, which says that when you find shale, it must be formed in some still condition, like in a lake or something like that. And how could that possibly happen during the flood? And so there's abundant evidence now that sand and mud, fine material, deposits from flowing water, not necessarily from still water.
And Don, would that be the same? I've just got a question in the live chat. It's been there for a while. I've been trying to get to it. How was chalk formed in Noah's flood? Is that a similar process, or is chalk a completely different process?
Chalk's a bit different, but there was a link there posted in the chat. I noticed one of our helpers, one of our friends group people, have posted a link which deals with the chalk. And the chalk, say, for example, the White Cliffs of Dover, that chalk is quite different to anything we see today. And it's actually consistent with it forming during the flood. In the blooms of the coccolithophores and the other organisms that form chalk, it's incredibly pure, and it doesn't fit with the modern day scenario at all. Again, the present is not the key to the past. So it formed during the flood, yeah.
Okay, so I think we've only got time for maybe one more question each. So I'll go over to John Ashton. Here's a question from Lou. And I've edited it down. It was quite a tome when it came in, but it was just basically they have trouble when they're talking to their religious education class about the children of Adam and Eve, and that the children had to marry each other, brothers and sisters marrying each other. Is there any way of describing that process without it coming across in a weird or perverted fashion?
There's the yuck factor.
It is, yeah.
Yeah, no, and I mean, and that is reasonable, and God has perhaps put the yuck factor there too. I think there's no easy answer I think that I can give now, because the background and the scenario with the children is going to be different. But we need a loving God, that this was the initial family, and this is how God had planned for human life to start in the beginning. But it wasn't the way it was meant to continue on. As the families grew, there obviously would have been more choice for a partner. So I can't think of any easy way that we can say that. Maybe young children won't, ask the question. That would be the easy way out, I guess, until they were old enough and teenagers, or just before teens, I guess, and learned about reproduction.
I guess the positive out of that question is he's actually coming from the right answer up front, that it would have been brothers and sisters marrying and having kids way back then. So congrats on getting the answer right first and teaching him the right answer, even though the kids don't really want to hear it. And one last question for you, Don, before we finish up for the night. And this is from Neville. I'll just see if I can find it in the question. There's actually two people, both Neville and John David came up with very similar questions. And it's about the animal dispersion after the flood. So how did the animals spread out after the flood, and did the earth divide into continents after? And just to follow up with John David's question, he was just talking about how did the animals get to where they are, especially the slow animals such as the sloth and the ones that don't move fast. How did they get to, like the panda, get to China, or the sloth get to the jungles of Borneo, etc. But I think you've got slides for Neville there.
I do have. First of all, because there are no sloths in the jungles of Borneo, they're actually South America and Central America, but it's still the same question. Also, you think about slow animals. How do they get there? Well, they got there slowly, I guess, but they came from the Middle East off the Ark, and they migrated around the world. A lot of people have the sort of idea that there are only kangaroos in Australia and nowhere else, and well, evolutionists say they evolved here and that's why they're here, but how do creationists explain that? But in fact, that's not the evidence at all. Living marsupials, this is actually a secular paper in Science Journals, volume 302. Living marsupials are restricted to Australia and South America. A lot of people don't realise there are opossums in South America, which are marsupials. In contrast, Metatherian fossils, that is marsupial fossils, from the late Cretaceous are exclusively from Eurasia and North America. And they say this geographical switch remains unexplained. So If anybody says that evolution explains things, it doesn't. It doesn't. In fact, they even said that when they didn't believe in continental drift, that evolution explained everything. Then they got continental drift, and evolution still explains everything. It's just storytelling. Now, if kangaroos came to Australia from the Middle East, and of course we see there the fossils in Eurasia and North America in the Cretaceous, is there any evidence that kangaroos have been elsewhere, for example? Well, this is actually cave art. Again, this was in Creation magazine, July 2020, almost 2 years ago. Again, subscribe to Creation magazine. Here we have cave art in Andhra Pradesh in India, and this is the original, and this is just highlighted or made look more contrast so you can see it. But clearly, here's a kangaroo, and here's one from up above, looking down on the kangaroo, the long tail and the head. And this is clearly a kangaroo in India. And so kangaroos were once in India, or maybe people from India travelled to Australia, but it was a long way to go. So they would have to go back. Kangaroos in India, possibility. And look up biogeography on creation.com, and there's some very good articles there, especially by Dominic Statham, and how the distribution of plants and animals around the world fits with their distribution after the flood, in some cases through rafting from place to place, not just animals, but plants as well, the plant distribution. This is called biogeography. You look up that on creation.com, you find a number of articles. And also the chapter in the Answers book, How Did Animals Get to Australia? Just a question about continental drift. No, I don't believe the continents drifted after the flood. I think the continental splitting up the continents and the plate tectonics happened during the flood, in which case the distribution of animals happened after that happened, after the flood. But, and there's a chapter in the Answers book about continental drift or plate tectonics as well. But chapter 17 is How Did the Animals Get to Australia?
Thanks, Don. What we're going to do now is just take a very short break. So stick with us just for this important announcement, and then we'll be back just to finish up the night.
My name is Scott Gillis, and I'm one of the many that work worldwide for Creation Ministries International. You know, even before I worked here, I loved to share the life-changing creation resources CMI produces, but I wrongly believed that the proceeds from these purchases was the main way that CMI was funded. You see, the core mission of CMI is evangelism. And each year we travel to over 1,000 churches around the world. And often, for the first time, believers get answers to those many nagging doubts about the Bible's history. And when believers are equipped and confident, they are more likely to share their faith with others, and people are getting saved.
Creation Ministries played an instrumental role in my wife and I coming to Christ a few years ago. Since then, Jesus has changed our priorities and even our desires. Now, one of my greatest pleasures is engaging non-believers about Jesus.
So please, seriously consider supporting CMI. Even a small amount every month adds up to make a huge difference. Thank you.
And thanks for staying with us. Just before we finish up the night, I'd just like to bring your attention to two resources. One's been mentioned plenty of times already tonight, and that's the Answers book. It's got over 60 answers to questions in it. It's written by PhD scientists, so they know what they're talking about. And it covers so many different questions about animal dispersion, radioactive dating, astronomy, so all the starlight and time questions. It does have answers to that, and apologies to the people that we didn't get to who had questions on starlight and time. That's another half hour of the show that we would have had to put on. But I would definitely recommend going into the store, looking for the Answers book. So creation.com/store. will get you those answers in the Creation Answers book, or you can just jump online, go to creation.com and look for the Answers book. We've got some of the chapters in PDF form. The other book that I would like to just bring to your attention is Does Evolution Explain Everything? about life. And this book is a response to an article that 10 arguments have been put forward, and we've got our own 10 PhD scientists, which they tackle the assertions of the 10 evolutionary counterparts within their own science domain. So lofty evolution claims are carefully assessed scientifically, enabling you to draw your own conclusions about the supposed power of evolution to explain life. So they're the two resources I'd like you to have a look at. Jump on our online, that's creation.com/store. And we'll just bring up the other gentleman now, just as we finish off the night. The other thing, I guess, and Don's mentioned this heaps of times, and you'll see, would have seen in the links in the chat, that there's so many articles on creation.com that explain have answers to all your questions, and they're also in the Creation magazine. So you can have a look for the magazine on creation.com. It's just one of the tabs across the top. Highly recommend you subscribing to that. And it comes out 4 times a year, and it's a fantastic magazine. Great as an as an evangelistic tool, not evolutionary tool. It cuts across the evolutionary garbage out there. So, gentlemen, I just want to thank you so much for coming on tonight and sharing your hearts and sharing your knowledge. You've done a Herculean effort getting through so many questions. We didn't get to them all, unfortunately, but I just want to thank you, John, for your expertise in the areas that you brought. And thank you, Don.
Brendan, just to say those people about the starlight and time question, there's an article on the front page of the website at present which deals with this. So
fantastic.
Just look for the it wasn't actually on the front page, but it's in the recent articles. So just click on the link there, which says more articles underneath the top banner, and you'll find the article which is answering starlight and time.
That's great. So if we could finish up for the night, Don, would you mind praying us out? And then I'll just explain what's coming up in 3 weeks' time.
Yeah, let's pray. So, Heavenly Father, we thank you for your word, which speaks truth from cover to cover. But above all, we thank you for the salvation which is available through the Lord Jesus Christ, that death and suffering came into the world through sin, but Jesus came and paid the price for our sin on the cross, having suffered in his body for our sin, and having been raised from the dead, having conquered death. And so, Lord, we thank you for the hope that we have in him. Those of us who are in Christ are your children in your forever family, and we look forward to the new heavens and new earth, where there be no more death and suffering and pain. And Lord, we thank you for your goodness towards us in Jesus. Pray that any who are online tonight that don't know him, that even tonight they would bow their knee before you and admit their need of forgiveness and receive that forgiveness through the Lord Jesus Christ, and know him as their Lord and Saviour, and share this with others that don't know him, that we might see fruit for your kingdom. For we ask it in Jesus' name. Amen.
Amen. Thank you, Don.